So you've just committed to a net zero goal. What's next? Hi, I'm Barbara, the co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specializing in the development of climate action strategies. To ensure that you're setting a credible target and to avoid reputational damage, you should be very clear in your communications as to what boundary your carbon neutral or net zero goal relates to. A net zero goal can relate to your operational emissions only, or it can extend out to your supply chain. It could relate to your whole organization or only to part of it. In this video, I'll be focusing on whether you should include Scope 3 emission sources. Now, if you're reporting under compliance-based schemes such as the NGER legislation in Australia, you'll probably be very aware of your Scope 1 and your Scope 2 carbon footprint. But for many organizations, up to 80% of the carbon footprint could be in the supply chain. So if you only have a very narrow focus on your emissions, you would neglect to see all those other emissions. So all up, there are 15 categories of upstream and downstream emissions, and I've talked about these in another video. But what you should be doing, and that's our recommendation, is to apply the relevance test to all those emission sources that you could have upstream and downstream of your organization. So good questions to ask to see whether an emission source is relevant is to see whether it's large in comparison to your Scope 1 and your Scope 2 emission sources. You should determine whether the emission source increases your greenhouse gas risk exposure, or whether your stakeholders deem the emission source critical to your operations. Also important would be whether you have influence to reduce the emissions, or if you can reduce the emission source directly. So have a look at those criteria for every emission source that you have to determine whether it's in or out. So a good way to do this is to gather a list of all your organizational stakeholders, all your critical stakeholders that have input into the project or need to shape the project. So get them all in one room, be it face-to-face or virtual, and look at all your emission sources. And then for every emission source, go through the relevance test to see whether it's a relevant emission source or not. And if it is relevant, then you should consider it in your net zero goal. So this is how we do it at 100% Renewables. We would typically show you your organizational boundary first. So that's your operational emissions, that's your Scope 1 and your Scope 2 emissions. So Scope 1 emissions typically are the burning of fossil fuels, just like, for instance, natural gas, or burning diesel and petrol in your vehicles. It could be landfill gas emissions if you're a council. It could be fugitive emissions if you are a mining operation. Now, if you have large chillers or refrigeration equipment, then fugitive emissions from those refrigerants should also form part of that goal and your Scope 1 emission source. Now, Scope 2 is a large emission source for most organizations because it's electricity consumption. Pretty much every organization has Scope 2 emissions, so a very important emission source. But if you look outside your operation and you put your operation in the whole value chain, you'll see that you have upstream emission sources. Now, I've dealt with them in another video, so you can have a look at that. But just very briefly, in terms of upstream emission sources, purchased goods and services, sometimes capital goods, can be a very large emission source. And if you ask your finance department for an extract of your general ledger to get the expenditure on these items, you'll see what I mean. So a large emission source. Now, upstream fuel energy, it's considered good practice to include that in your carbon footprint. It's easy to calculate, it's just best practice. Transportation distribution could be couriers or logistics providers that you could look at, postage. Waste from operations, pretty much every organization has waste, so if it's big in comparison to others, etc., relevance test, you should maybe include that as well. Business travel are things like air travel, accommodation, taxi travel. Staff commuting can be important if lots of your employees use their cars to get to work. And leased assets means that you should also look at assets that you lease, not just the assets that you own. So in terms of your downstream activities, you may find that you have emission sources there that are relevant. For instance, say you're producing vacuum cleaners or laptops and these products are being used downstream by your customers. The electricity consumption of your goods would be considered as Scope 3 emission source. So if that's relevant to you, then maybe that should form part of your net zero goal as well. And so just to give you the full picture, your organization's activities Scope 1, Scope 2 fairly narrow, but if you make it broader to include your Scope 3 emissions, you'll see it's a much bigger boundary that you'll be setting around your net zero goal. So recommendation is to, before you even start putting a plan together on how you're going to reach net zero, to really clearly define the boundary of what forms part of the net zero goal, so that you can develop a net zero strategy based on everything that is in your boundary. Now, I hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you.